Reading 32 from the Psychological Commentaries on the Teaching of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky by Dr. Maurice Nicoll, Volume 3. Cormid Uglé, May 25, 1946. Commentary on Identifying. We are told in this work that one of the things that we have to observe in ourselves is identifying. It is said that identifying is the most terrible force acting on this planet, that keeps people asleep and so prevents them from awakening. As we are, that is, as mechanical people who do everything mechanically and have not got any proper consciousness, we identify at every moment. We identify with our thoughts, with our feelings, and we identify with what happens in outer life. In this way, we are kept in prison without realizing it. And only through the development of consciousness can we get out of this prison. Only a few people wish to do so, namely those people who have what is called magnetic center, and therefore feel that there must be something different, and seek to try to find it. All of us have what are called unnecessary emotions, the source of which is identification. Our emotional center, which is the most important center in us, and is capable eventually of connecting us with higher emotional center, is in a very bad state. In the first place, it is full of acquired negative emotions which we have imitated from others. By birth, our emotional center is free from negative emotions, and by birth we are born in a very small way awake. There is a kind of innocence in small children, which they lose very soon through identifying. This innocence, if we can call it so, belongs to essence. But soon it becomes surrounded by personality and false personality, and we lose our original center of gravity, which passes from essence into personality. We then become, so to speak, invented people, carrying on a fictitious life. You have only to look back at some of the older magazines, say, of 40 or 50 years ago, to notice how artificial everyone looks in the illustrations or photographs, and how unreal the romances and stories are. One wonders how people could behave like that, dress like that, do things like that, and yet we are in exactly the same state of hypnotism at every moment. Now, when you look at these older prints, these older stories, and wonder how people could do things like that, you are really looking at the power of identifying and the power that identification has over humanity. And yet, you think that you yourself are not identified at all. As you know, humanity is kept asleep for certain reasons, but it is always possible for a certain number of people to awaken from this sleep, which comes partly through identifying. Each one of you is identified at this moment. Each one of you has 101 unnecessary emotions. Each one of you is identified with 101 unnecessary thoughts. When a man is totally asleep, he is identified with every thought that comes to him automatically, and every mood that arises in him automatically, and every feeling. He takes all this as his life, and in fact, more than this, he takes it as his necessary life. In the work of self-observation, we are told in what direction to observe ourselves, and the reason for this is to be able to separate ourselves very gradually from all these unnecessary forms of identifying with transient thoughts, moods, and feelings. We then begin to have something that stands behind us. We then begin to see ourselves, as it were, on the stage in front of us. We begin to see all sorts of different eyes in us, saying this and thinking that, and behaving like that, and holding forth like that, as something unreal, something that is not oneself, something that has nothing to do with real I. In other words, we begin to see our mechanicalness. All this is a very great step to take, and once a person has taken it, he or she can never be the same person again. But the power of identifying is so tremendous that even although we may reach a state when for a moment we are separated from our personality, at the next moment we fall down right into it. That is, when we have reached the stage of having been able to walk on the waters for a moment, at the next moment we sink. We are then once more in the small theater of our mechanical selves with its self-dramas. The work says that we must struggle every day with identifying, and that this struggle takes very many forms and directions. For example, a man may, through self-observation, realize that he identifies with someone or with some forms of thought or emotion, and may for a time separate himself from that particular kind of identifying, but he will find that he begins to identify with something else, far more. At first, he accepts this, and is quite certain that in this respect he is not identified. Then he realizes what has happened. So the struggle must continue all his life. Sometimes people say, surely we should identify, because then we feel real emotions, and so on. This is not correct. You can feel no real emotions if you identify. In fact, the work says that as we are, we know only one emotion or one taste, the taste of being identified. As you know, we identify particularly with our negative states, with our negative moods, and with our negative thoughts. The work speaks very little about positive emotions. At the same time, it says that positive emotions are possible, but that they have no trace of identifying, no taste of identification. They are not self-emotions, forms of self-liking. All self-emotions are forms of identifying. Positive emotions have no such taste and are not self-emotions. We cannot create them at present unless we try to do this work sincerely, unless especially we try to follow the 3 lines of the work. The first line is work on oneself, which begins with sincere and uncritical self-observation according to what we are taught by the work to observe. The second line is work in connection with one another, to understand one another, and not to react mechanically to the unpleasant manifestations of others in the work, to learn a common language, and so externally to consider them. The third line is to help those teaching the work and to assist in the transmission of it. If these lines are followed, especially the first and second, we may have as a reward flashes of positive emotion, whose taste, whose instantaneous quality is utterly different from the ordinary, heavy emotions amongst which we live. What we might call our positive emotions are not really positive emotions, because they turn very easily into their opposites, namely into negative emotions. For example, you are feeling very pleased with yourself. You are feeling fine, feeling good, and all the rest of it, and someone says something to you of an unpleasant nature, and the next moment you are plunged into negative emotion. Now, the point about real positive emotions is that they never have an opposite in them. That is, they can never turn into negative emotions. They may come in a flash and then disappear, but they cannot turn into any opposite thing, into a negative state. And also, they always make you see things that you never saw before, like a sudden vision. That is to say, their cognitive value is very great. The next moment, you have dropped down to an ordinary level, and you forget what you saw and cannot record it, and yet you know that you saw something that you had never seen before, some aspect of truth, of meaning. Now, if anybody has had in the past, or does have in the future, such traces of positive emotion, he or she must register them as being of very high value, even although one cannot remember what exactly happens. The most hopeless thing is to regard them as mere nonsense. Positive emotions cannot reach us in the second state of consciousness, but they can reach us in the third state of consciousness, self-remembering or self-awareness. When a man is absorbed in his private interests, in his self-emotions, in his vanity, in his self-complacency, in his moral arrogance, in his feeling that he is always right, in his complaints, and all the rest of it. That is, when a man is completely identified with himself, he can never receive a trace of positive emotion. That is why it is so necessary to begin to work on oneself and to separate oneself from oneself. When a man remembers himself, he is not identified. That is when a man reaches the third level of consciousness that exists in all humanity and is really their birthright. He is in a state of consciousness that can receive help from higher centers, namely from conscious humanity. But when a man is in the second state of consciousness, he is always in a constant state of identifying with money, identifying with people, and identifying with ambition, and identifying with himself. And so he is asleep and under the law of accident. In the second state of consciousness, the so-called waking state, nothing from a higher level of being can reach us. So everything will go in the only possible way it can go, because everyone is then a machine, and no one can do.